Hi everyone, welcome to the third lesson of resilience. Today, as you can see, we'll be finishing up with thinking traps. So last week, we talked about these 5 negative, very common thinking traps. But now that we've gotten this knowledge, what can we do with it? Don't forget the G.I. Joe fallacy from August's The Science of Well-Being course. Knowing is not half the battle. Once you know something, you've still got to be able to apply it into your life in order to make a change. So knowing these 5 thinking traps, the first thing we can do is develop some empathy for others, because these, like I said, are very common thinking traps. And so you might be able to identify it in others when others are thinking in this way, and it'll help you understand others a little better as well. This can also mean that you can help open communication between you and the other people around you, because you identify that perhaps somebody is mind reading and they're just not on the same page as you. You can also help educate them about these thinking traps, which helps open up some communication about the biases that you guys have and just the way you guys perceive the world. And finally, for yourself, you can do something called real-time resilience. So now that you know these very common thinking traps that everybody has, when you have one of these thoughts, you're able to identify it and fight against it. But how can you fight against it? Well, let's talk about that. So there are 3 main ways you can fight against it, and each of them has a sentence starter that pairs with it. So one thing you can do is evidence. So if your non-resilient thinking is telling you one thing, find evidence and compelling evidence, real evidence in your life that tells that non-resilient thinking otherwise. So that sentence starter would be, that's not true because blank. The second thing you can do is reframe whatever that non-resilient thinking is saying. So it might be true in some aspect, but it's just not positive and optimistic. So if you reframe it into a more positive and optimistic way, then you're more likely to be resilient. So that sentence starter would be something like, a better way to see this is blank. Finally, the last way you can do this is through a plan. So some of the non-resilient thinking, especially catastrophizing and helplessness, will sort of block you from taking action. You'll be really agitated and anxious, and you might feel helpless. But if you come up with a plan, you'll be able to feel a lot more confident and be able to tackle whatever that challenge is. So that sentence starter would be, if blank happens, then I will blank. This has actually helped me in my life, because when I got a bad mark, I used to get really frustrated with myself. But now, by using this technique, I can say, if I got a bad mark, then I will go to my teacher to talk about the mistakes that I made so that I can improve my grade and improve on my next tests and projects. I can ask my teacher if there's any extra credit, and I can talk with my teacher and work with my peers to see what else I can do to improve. All right, so that's what you can do with these thinking traps, how to fight against it. But I also wanted to quickly talk about catastrophizing once again, because my explanation on it was a little bit simplified. There's a lot of different styles for catastrophizing, and there's different triggers as well. So last time I used this image to portray catastrophizing, and that only portrays one of the styles of catastrophizing, which is scattershot. So this is when you get a negative situation and then just like your brain goes into a million different directions of different bad situations that could happen from that event. The next thing is a downward spiral. So this is sort of the example that I did last week, I think, for helplessness. So the downward spiral would be something like, oh, I got a bad grade, which means that my average is going to be really bad, which means I can't go to very good universities, which means that I probably can't get into med school, which means that I'm not going to be able to get my dream job. You guys remember the example. You can see that it sort of just goes down into a downward spiral. And finally, circling is the third style, and that's basically just a cycle. So for example, I got a bad grade, which means my teacher doesn't think I'm a good student, which means my average is going to drop, which means that I'm going to keep getting bad grades because my teacher thinks I'm a bad student. Something like that. That wasn't super complete, but sort of a circle. The triggers for catastrophizing, ambiguity was the one that I used last week for an example. So this was when I said, oh, you got a text from your boss that says, just come to my office after your shift or something like that. Because it's ambiguous, you can start catastrophizing because you don't have enough information. But there's other ways that catastrophizing can be triggered. The second thing is when something you value may be at stake. So for example, if you have a partner and that partner has just seemed cold lately, you might catastrophize and say, oh my gosh, they're falling out of love with me and they don't want me in their life anymore. However, you could just communicate with them. So if you go back to the plan part, from the real-time resilience techniques, you can say, if my partner isn't responding to me, I can try to approach them face-to-face and just sit down and talk with them. The next trigger for catastrophizing is if you have an existing fear already. So, for example, if you have a fear of heights, then you might not want to go on like a roller coaster with a really high drop because you might be like, oh my gosh, that's way too high. I'm literally going to die of fright. So sometimes when we have an existing fear already, we'll catastrophize about that. And finally, you're more prone to catastrophizing if you're feeling run down. So if you're not getting enough sleep, if you're not really exercising, you're not taking care of yourself, then you're more likely to be in a negative mindset. And so you're more likely to catastrophize. And so you should take care of yourself. I definitely need that advice from myself. Oh my gosh, university applications have been stressful. But anyway, that's not part of resilience. The reason I wanted to talk about this is not only because catastrophizing is a little more complicated than I explained last time, but also because catastrophizing can cause really high, unhealthy levels of anxiety. And don't get me wrong, anxiety can be good. It's kind of like stress. It can motivate you, but if it's too high, which is what happens when you catastrophize, then you can have a lot of really bad symptoms. You can be affected both mentally and physically. And that leads me to the next lesson, which we'll be talking about how to manage your anxiety if it's too high. You obviously don't want to have like zero anxiety because that's not good as well. Okay, anyway, I hope that gets you a little bit hyped up for next week's lesson and have a great week. See you next week.